So welcome to our panel discussion today on assistive technology. My name's Griffin Longley. I work for an organisation that's about getting kids outside, away from technology. And ironically, we tend to do an awful lot of using technology to do that. So we use social media and websites and apps and all sorts of things. So technology plays a role in lots of areas of our lives. But we have a tendency to think about technology in terms of convenience and disruption. So if you think about social media, we think about it being convenient in how it allows us to connect with people we know. And we think about it as being a disruption in terms of how it can get in the way of how we relate face to face. Refrigeration, convenient for keeping our food. Very disruptive to people who used to sell ice door to door. But assistive technology moves the dial from convenience to the profound. Assistive technology is technology that allows people to perform tasks that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. We have a fantastic panel today to introduce us to this area of assistive technology and to chew on some of the questions that are embedded in it. So we're going to get started. I'm going to invite Danielle Louzio-Lake. Danielle is project lead of the Independent Living Centre's @Chat program, which is a peer-to-peer information sharing system for people with disabilities. Danielle, if I can invite you to begin by introducing yourself and your work.
Sure. So yes, my name is Danielle and I'm the project lead of @Chat, Assistive Technology Chat, and we are working on a truly peer-led initiative where people with disability are leading the way information and advice is shared around assistive technology. These opportunities have come about for a few things. We have the Ndis, which is coming in. We have more choice and control for people with disability. It's a very exciting time, and for us, myself and Joss, along with the rest of the @Chat team, and there are a few others here today, it's great to be able to be in control of the conversation around assistive technology for people with disability and helping others with their journey to finding the right assistive technology. So that's my work. My story, about 17 years ago, so don't do the math, but I've lived longer with a disability than I haven't. And I acquired a spinal cord injury. I used to do aerial skiing. So as you can imagine, my life as an athlete was very different to the life of someone with a disability. And I literally, on that day that my life came crashing down, my whole journey shifted to a very different space. And at times that was very frightening. It challenged me in my mind to be able to think, how am I going to achieve the goals that I want to in my life? How am I going to be employed in the type of jobs that I thought that I would be now that I have a very different body to what I did before? I used a wheelchair for a long time, and I will probably go back to using one at some point. And I'm really pleased to say that I'm okay with all of that now. So it was psychologically a journey for me, and I've learnt so much, and often it's from other people with disabilities and their experiences about what's available to me. And there's so much assistive technology available that can help you to do all the things that you want to do. So I'm a mum, I work, I'm very busy. I still do a lot of bike riding. I'm getting back into sit skiing as well, so skiing in a different way. But all those assistive technologies have allowed me to possibly even have a more wholesome life than I thought possible. So yeah.
Thanks, Danielle. And our panellists at the end, Jocelyn Franciscus. Jocelyn is an occupational therapist and also a key member of the @Chat team. And she's also someone who is really committed to helping people with spinal cord injury access assistive technology. Jocelyn.
Thanks for the introduction. I think for me the most powerful way, and I might run some slides if that's okay, it's a little bit about @Chat in the background, but for me the most powerful way to help people understand assistive technology is really to share my own story. You know, I went my whole life not paying too much attention to the intricacies of assistive technology. It's not that I didn't know what it was or how to prescribe it. I was, as Griffin said, an occupational therapist by profession, but I didn't truly understand its transformational power until I had to use it every single day of my life. In my late 20s, my world as I knew it had changed as I went through an accident and injured my spinal cord. In a bit of bad luck, I actually injured my neck quite high up, which left me with a condition called quadriplegia, which basically means 4 limbs affected by paralysis. Simply put, I can't grasp things, write with a pen, flick a switch, or walk. But before you feel sorry for me, don't. It's with the help of assistive technology that it's helped me to do all of these things in a different way. I have adapted ring cutlery so I can eat without too much fuss, grip gloves so I can hold on to assisted exercise equipment and the great things in life like wine glasses. I have an iPad so I can write, email, shop. I mean, that's way better than a pen anyway, right? Home automation so that I can switch on my lights, aircon, TV, open my door. A powered wheelchair to walk around. So that's a bit of a stretch. But if you ask anyone who's a wheelchair user, they'll often say that the wheelchair is their legs. Just don't say that we're confined to one, because for us, it gives us the freedom to roam, explore, and to sometimes get bogged. The point I'm trying to make is that assistive technology for many people like myself isn't a necessity, just a necessity. It gives us the capability to pursue goals, better ourselves, and share in the human experience. It helps us connect, communicate, travel, work, have hobbies, and dare I say, the best hobby of them all, sex. Yes, it helps with all of those things, and I'm so proud to say that I do work within AtChat, which is a peer-to-peer information sharing and mentoring platform for people who use assistive tech.
Thanks, Joss. If I can introduce now Professor Jane Burns. Jane is an e-mental health researcher and advocate, and she's also the chair of Street, which is a social enterprise for young people at risk of homelessness and veterans' families counselling service. Jane.
Thanks, Griff. I started my career many years ago. I won't even mention how many, before technologies really had come to the fore. And one of the things that was incredible back then, and I was working in suicide prevention, and it's fair to say we still have not cracked that nut. 8 people take their lives every day in Australia. But one thing was fascinating around peer-to-peer support networks online, and reachout.com was the world's first online peer-to-peer support network for young people with a mental health condition. It was established back in 1997. So we're 20 years on, but what I now find incredible is that through the use of an iPhone, we can provide support to people who live with a mental health condition through the use of apps, e-tools, online communities, storytelling, creativity, a whole host of things that connect people in ways that we had never, ever imagined. So while people talk a lot about risk and about the terrible things around technologies and cyberbullying and all of the bad things, for me, I've been dedicated to really understanding how we can build on the strengths and capacities of people, whether they are in a wheelchair, whether they are living with a disability, whether they have a mental illness like anxiety that's so severe that they can't leave their homes, to determine how we can actually build on those strengths and capacities so that people can work, so that they can have their families, so they can be a part of community. As I said, I started many years ago, but what became really obvious to me as we've progressed is the amazing capacity of technologies to connect people in ways we'd never imagined. And so my little boy was born 11 years ago now today, and he lives with both Down syndrome and autism. He's non-verbal, so he has no capacity to talk, and yet through the use of his iPad, he can communicate. He uses an app called Proloquo to Go. He can, when he chooses to, because he often doesn't, he can ask for something that he wants. He can tell us that his head hurts and that he needs a drink of water. He can say to me, I want to make a jack-o'-lantern, even though I've never taught him what a jack-o'-lantern is. So the power of these technologies to improve the lives of those people who are most vulnerable, and I've been particularly interested in the NDIS, having just got him onto it, about the way in which these technologies can be transformative. We did a lot of work in apps. I think apps is just a sort of tiny tipping point of it, but it's really around how do you create opportunities for people to connect, to be creative, to tell their stories, to share their stories, and to really engage in communities where they haven't had that opportunity before, whether that's online or whether it's face-to-face. And increasingly we're seeing the blurring of the lines that really allow us to understand how you can fundamentally look at the strengths and the nature of humans, which is about striving in the face of adversity, regardless of what that adversity is. So I might finish there.
Thank you, Jane. And our final panellist is Associate Professor Munjed Muderis. Munjed is an Australian-trained orthopaedic surgeon, a squadron leader in the Australian Air Force Reserve, an ambassador to the Australian Red Cross, a human rights activist and a refugee. But he's also a pioneer of a revolutionary technology known as osseointegration. Welcome, Munjed.
Thank you very much, Griffin. Hi, my name is Munjed. I was born in Iraq, Baghdad, and I grew up in a very privileged way. I didn't think that I will end up in Australia or anywhere outside Iraq, but then things changed in my 20s where I had to leave Iraq because I refused to mutilate army deserters' ears, and I ended up being on a boat to Australia. And after spending some time in detention center, I learned how to become a human being, and then I moved on with my life, and I became a doctor here. My life is divided in many different sections, and sadly, the smallest section is my family life, and I'm working on improving that, but I earn my living by doing hip and knee surgery, joint replacement. It's boring like batshit, but pay the bills. I have a great deal of passion toward technology that inspired me when I was at the age of 12 when I watched the movie The Terminator, and I always wanted to do half human, half machine. And this technology is called osseointegration, and then that developed into further technologies like target muscle reinnervation. I'm going to give a talk about that later on down the track. But then another section of my life is I'm a pain in the butt for the government because I advocate for human rights and equality and tolerance among each other. And the last section of what I do is what I enjoy most is do a lot of outreach work in developing countries such as Cambodia, China, India, Iraq, and America.
Yeah. Thanks very much. So you can see we've got a pretty amazing and diverse panel here today. So we've got Munjed, who's very much in the hardware end of assistive technology. We've got the AtChat team, who are very much in the connecting people through peer-to-peer platforms. And we've got Jane, who's very much in the mobile technology. How do we work with people's strengths and capacities and bolster that through online platforms? So we've got a fantastic conversation ahead of us. So I'm going to begin it by just throwing out a question for the panel. Everyone please be aware we're going to have some time for questions at the end. We're going to make sure we do keep that time. So please, if you've got some ideas, things you want to ask, hold on to them for the end. So my first question is a very broad one. When you're thinking about assistive technology at the moment, the world you guys are all very much embedded in, what are the things that are really exciting you now? What are the areas that are really booming and exciting and capturing your imagination? Open up to all four of you, whoever wants to start.
You guys go first.
Sure. So for me within my work, and I'm learning this more and more as we connect with the wider community of people with disability, is something called universal design. So it's when technology, and always the iPad is used as an example because everyone knows what the iPad is. And I think, Jane, you mentioned it, is that it's got built-in accessibility for pretty much everyone. It has possibility for people that are vision impaired or blind. It has possibilities for, like Jane said, for people, autistic people, and for anyone that has mobility limitations, there's a lot of built-in accessibility. But the thing about the iPad is, as an example of universal design, is that it is non-stigmatised. So it's not a disabled person's thing. And I love where technology creates not disabled people's things. We're just all people together living in a society that's more fluid and seamless. It's me.
And yeah, I agree with, I'm really excited about voice-activated technologies. And again, that's, you know, you can get them for $100, $200. It's integrated. I'm talking about Google Home or Amazon Alexa, and the built-in accessibility and ability to be able to talk to the TV, the lights. So it's becoming, I think the world of AT is becoming more integrated just into everyday life, and that, you know, and what's good for people with disabilities is also great for everyday people. And you're starting to see, you know, a lot of my friends who don't have disabilities, they love those sorts of technologies. So I think that's a really, really exciting. The other thing that's really exciting me is people with disabilities who are actually going out there and creating and inventing their own assistive tech. We recently did a video on a gentleman called Gary, and he had an accident, but he did own a property, about 14 acres. And, you know, he's probably about similar movement to myself. And he can remotely run his whole property, his gates, his reticulation system, all from an app. He put a little tow bar on the back of his wheelchair, and now he mows the grass. I talked to him the other day, and apparently he's figured out a way to whippersnipper around his fence poles. I'm not sure how he's figured it out, but he's invented it with his friend. And, you know, for me, that's incredibly exciting to see people with disabilities sort of take charge of their own, you know, futures with assistive technology being one of those pathways. So
I'd just like to clarify, when Joss and I speak about assistive technology, we're talking about any equipment, aid, device or system that enables a person to do the things that they want to do.
So I might add to what you've said, because I think that the thing that I'm most excited about is obviously the empowerment of consumers. So we've shifted from very medical top-down models, no offence, to one where people make choices about what they want to use, how they want to use it, and how it actually builds their capacity to be engaged in their communities. We know the single most important thing around mental health, and this is not related to mental illness, to mental health for all of us, is having a voice, being empowered, being connected, and building on your capacities and being able to do things that make you feel good about yourself, no matter what that is. So that, to me, the peer-to-peer networks and people driving change through the use of their own data, and, you know, if you jump onto this thing, and even if you download some of the apps and use them, you can have a dashboard that shows you how you're performing during the day around your sleep and your activity. You can start to identify what are your trigger points if you're feeling stressed. So to me, the next iteration of that is how you bring all of these different pieces of technology together. And the biometrics are fascinating. So the potential to actually wear technologies that capture physiological responses rather than relying on the doctor to diagnose or the doctor to describe, really starting to self-manage and think about how you can use those technologies to almost manipulate your own thoughts, your feelings, your behaviours, your actions, but from a well-being perspective rather than from an illness perspective, and identifying early how you keep yourself mentally healthy, fit and well. In the veteran space, and you probably know this from your own personal experience, people are exposed to horrific things. Brains, like bodies, break. And I think the real challenge that we've got is not around stigma, even though we tend to be obsessed with stigma and reducing stigma. It's really helping people understand that the brain is like the physical, that we need to nurture it and look after it, and that sometimes it will break. And how do we support it to then rebuild and regrow and be healthy again, no matter what that looks like. So it's the biometrics, but also the combination of all of these different technologies coming together to empower people to make choice.
The way I look at disability is the disability of the mind. There is no such thing called disability of the body. I feel very disabled, and most of the time during my day-to-day activity, because I don't know how to read, I don't know how to write, and I'm completely illiterate in many things. So the advancement in technologies and assistive technologies that I'm very excited about are two aspects. Number one is the ability to communicate, and assistive technology with expanding communication availability and ease for people all around the world, that's getting to a different level, where now we can know each other through a third person, while in my lifetime, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was through 7-person. And that's a huge advancement, and because as human beings, we are designed to communicate with each other. So that's a major advancement, and that's going at a lightning speed, and it's very exciting. At the same time, it's freaking because people are moving away from enjoying their time outside and with nature and spending time to themselves. But we do have a choice, and it's up to us how to choose the way we live. The other aspect that I see very exciting is lithium batteries, and they are getting a lot lighter, they are getting a lot smaller, and they are getting a lot more powerful. So in our lifetime, you will see people riding robots, and whether flying robots or riding robots to work. And I hope that I will never see the time where we have bigger heads, very short arms, very short legs, because that's what's going to happen, and we'll have no hair, and we'll look like aliens. But this will happen. Technology is moving us that way, and whether you look at it in a good way or a bad way, that's the way we're heading.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it, that technology is moving so fast in all of these areas, but as a society we tend to move quite slowly, or certainly our policy settings, even the debates around what's an appropriate use of technology, how does technology and health sit together. What's your guys' thoughts on how we address that speed of change? I mean, we're not going to slow it down, but how do we keep pace? What's getting in the way of us being ahead of that curve?
I think that little chat we had before about ethics is the centre point of that, and also in the area that we work, choice and control. Technology may be there, it may be available, but is it the right thing at the right time? And for those that didn't hear Munjed in my conversation earlier, we were talking about how someone that had an incomplete spinal cord injury that walked a bit differently, which was certainly my journey. It took me a long time to walk the way that I do now. In the early stages, if someone like Munjed had have said, oh, I can do this, I can take your legs off and give you robotic legs, I may have taken that option in the earlier stages because I just wanted to walk and I didn't know if I was going to be able to. But something that happens with time, and the beauty of time, is that I'd learnt that having a disability is certainly not the worst thing in the world, and I did find lots of ways to activate my body and get it going, and then using assistive technology to bridge the gap. So I think there's those ethical things around technology might be there, but is it necessarily the right thing for the person at the time? And that's kind of Pandora's box. I mean, you could really debate that from different points of view.
So we have three things. Number one, God. Number two, medicine. Number three, iPads and Apple, okay? And Apple is winning by far.
I was going to ask about the order of it.
Okay, so this is my classic day-to-day work. Forget about how I earn money, but what I deal with, what I enjoy a lot more, is dealing with problems. And I'm trying to establish the first center in the world of limb reconstructive technology, where it's, I'm sure I will go to jail eventually as a result of that, but because we are very regulated, we are extremely policed, and there is no room in our society for innovation, because innovators are crazy people that experiment. But the wheel of development doesn't move unless you have people that are crazy a little bit and think outside the box. And we are surrounded, medical fraternity is the biggest dogma in the world. And we all very traditional and tunnel thinkers, and we don't want to see outside. So, and I surround myself with people like that to protect myself, basically, and protect people from me, usually. And so the classic scenario that I have is a patient coming to me with some sort of disability, and I know factually that robots can fix the problem, but you have to take an extreme measure of taking part of the limb or a limb off to replace it by a robot to give this patient the ability to move. Now, this is way outside the box, and it's and I tell it to my patients that I've treated before. If you go and sue me, you will win 100%, because you will find hundreds of doctors.
I'm not sure who your PR person is, but you need to get a PR person. They shouldn't be sending that message.
But that's the thing. It is what it is, because we live in a society that's very regressive, and it doesn't want to move forward. So it is a major ethical dilemma when we have a situation where you have someone with a disability, and the standard solution is that, we can do this, we can do that, and that will make you feel better, will get a little bit better with pain, you can walk a little bit better, but will never be perfect. And then you have the alternative where you can replace it altogether by something else that's made by a company, and that can be a much superior option, but it's completely out there.
And can I say a counterpoint to that is also having the attitude towards people with disability that maybe also having them more included in society, and looking at things like accessibility as well, built-in accessibility, so that they maybe don't have to take such a drastic decision, and that they can actually just be able to get around a lot easier, have a society where they can, cross the road easily. And I don't know, I think, there's sort of that middle ground that could exist as well for people with disabilities, if there's just a lot more awareness and accepting of it, yeah.
And just to add to that, I think there's two things. One is a fear of the unknown. So up until relatively recently, we were locking people up in asylums. We were closing the doors. We were not able to see diversity of experience, whether that was with a disability or whether that was with a mental illness. That shifted, and so now we have a community that is supposedly much more progressive and accepting of differences. And yet a lot of our structures and a lot of our workplaces and our environments, whether they're schools or universities or community, discriminate against people with disabilities, regardless of what that disability is. So I think we've got a long way to come in acceptance of diversity. And there are disabilities which are very obvious, i.e. being in a wheelchair or being blind, and not being able to hear, versus disabilities which aren't so obvious, like autism.
And that can sometimes be more challenging, can't it, Jane?
Oh, without a doubt. And often, a lot of the friends that I've got who have children with autism, their kids look normal.
Yeah.
So a lot of the discrimination comes from this normalisation of what we expect behaviours to be. And yet when you think about some of the capacities of people who live with autism and the way in which they could fundamentally change our societies and our jobs and the way in which we operate, it's mind-boggling, and I think it's starting to happen. The second is, and I think it picks up on your point around our structures in terms of the medicalisation of particular illnesses, whether it's illness, disability, mental health, physical health. We tend to have a system that encourages people to be unwell and encourages doctors to keep people unwell, even though the job is to get people better. And so until we change that and start to think about strengths and capacities, we're probably going to always perpetuate this myth that there's disability rather than ability. There's disability in mental illness. There's challenges in mental illness rather than there's strengths and capacity in what people are experiencing. And I'll give one example, and it's around my health record, and I don't expect anyone to put their hand up and say, I'm going to opt out or opt in, but it's an interesting dilemma because the story that's being told is around safety of your data, and yet the system's being set up in a way that should potentially be safe. And when you look at all the literature, and I know we've talked a little bit about research and evidence-informed practice, my health record or an electronic health record actually improves outcomes for people. And yet we're not talking about the capacity of a technology like that to really fundamentally change the way doctors do practice and the way people engage with professions, whether that's a GP or whether it's a psychologist or psychiatrist, around real-world data and real-time data. So that's a big challenge, I think, and those conversations are not easy conversations or simple conversations. We touched briefly on ethics and ethical dilemmas. These are hard topics to talk about.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I wonder if I might... Oh, go ahead.
Griff, just one quick thing. I'm hearing what Munjed's saying about the medical space and how that's got a lot of constraints to innovation. I think it's also worth mentioning that we work within the disability sector. It's a changing sector, and we've got the overarching NDIS, and we're actually very supported in innovation, and that's really encouraged, particularly peer-led initiatives. So it's interesting that there's one part of healthcare or wellness that is very limited in innovation, yet our space is really requiring it to help people get that, improve that capacity and have those more improved long-term outcomes.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm wondering if for the benefit of our audience, if the panel wouldn't mind, a question without notice, offering an example of how the assistive technologies we're talking about can beneficially impact people's lives, things you've seen or heard, because I think that might put it in a more grounded framework. Jane?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. So I ran a cooperative research centre with 75 organisations across the mental health space, but also had partners Google, Facebook and Twitter. Now, the decision to have those industry partners was, I think, the right decision because they are reaching those who are most hard to reach. One of the first projects we did, and we did 39 of them, so there's a lot of examples of how technologies have been fundamentally groundbreaking and life-changing for people. But we prioritised disability to begin with, and we set up what we called a lab. And it was an innovation idea that came out of one of our universities in Victoria. And the idea was that children and young people who are on the autism spectrum would come in and design a game. And they would sit with developers to design this game, and they would work with each other to have a conversation about these games. And we fundamentally did not care what the game was. What we wanted to do was to build the social cohesion of these groups to come together and have conversations about what it meant to do something that they loved, which was gaming. We also set up a separate room which was for the parents to have conversations about how they could work with their children, their young people, to connect them and to create meaningful lives for them. And that was the first major project that we ran, and we got a little young guy to come in and talk to our board. So this is a 12-year-old who was obsessed with Mario Super Brothers. And for those of you who don't know it, Mario is this little machine avatar that runs around with a red hat and little yellow pants, I think.
Moustache.
Yeah.
Yep.
Anyway, this kid dressed like him. So he comes in, and my board, and it was a high-powered board, you know, it's a board of senior execs from around Australia. And this little kid comes in with his mum, and he puts up on the screen this game that he's created, and we're all looking at it going, don't know what it is, don't know what it does. But it didn't matter. What mattered, and the data came in afterwards, was around the sense of social connectedness, the sense of participation, and the fact that, that these kids felt that they were doing something that was incredibly valuable. The sense of purpose for the family, that where they had thought our children are going to be living in their rooms for the rest of their lives playing games, the sense that they've actually got something that's a strength that will allow them to go into a workplace and work in a very different way. So that was profoundly, I think, in that first little pilot, one of the most impactful projects that has gone on, I think, to shape the way we do think about autism. Out of not just that, but many things came the ICANN network, which is about autism and how people with autism have different skills. So that's one example of a really simple thing around gaming and building a game that had really nothing to do with the technology and everything to do with the social connection.
Thanks, Jane.
You go.
I don't know what to say.
Don't know what to say.
About one of your patients, and I've seen a clip on YouTube about a British patient, an army veteran. Can you tell us a bit about that example?
I mean, definitely, awareness is very important, and we have patients themselves. They started networking and trying to expand the knowledge about technologies that we can provide among themselves and to throughout the social media, basically. And it is a very powerful tool because that forum turned from just chit-chat of patients among themselves to enlighten a wider public of people who with amputations and with spinal cord injury, etc. And then that forum is growing bigger and bigger and becoming like it's snowballing in one way. It's all about like communication and basically it's going sideways from the medical fraternity where they develop something called the peer-to-peer assistant and help. And to be honest, I'm a very open-minded person, and I go and look at it every now and then, and frankly, I learned a lot from it. And you see what patients discuss and what they come up with ideas and new information that we're completely oblivious to, and that I'm one of the people that benefit from it more than anything else, and it's very healthy because obviously you get the odd kind of right-wing and left-wing kind of opinions, but the majority of people are very sensible and in the mainstream, and their purpose of it is to help each other, basically.
Munjed, are you able to tell the audience a little bit about the surgical intervention that you were able to perform for that patient, the British soldier, and what that meant for him?
Well, we treated around 50 British soldiers so far, so the vast majority of these soldiers have lost both limbs above the knee, and some of them are quad amputees, some of them are triple amputees, and some of them are unilateral amputees, whether in an arm or in a leg. And what we do to them is these people struggle with their mobility with the traditional socket-mounted prosthesis. Socket-mounted prosthesis is like a bucket that sits around the limb, and this technology has been there since 1525, where it was invented by a French naval surgeon, and since then that technology hasn't changed. And what we came up with is a new technology where we skeletally integrate a limb and attach the bone to a prosthetic limb, basically. In the lower limb is a prosthetic limb that is connected to the bone, and then you rejig the muscles that are still in the residuum, and in a way to make it as functional as possible, and then you hook it up to a robotic prosthesis. In the upper limb, you go one step more, where you use the nerves that are amputated, basically, and organize them to be attached to muscles that are not used, and then these muscles are connected and wired to a prosthetic robot and become amplifiers for the signals that are transmitted from the brain to the robot, and basically that give the person the ability to operate a hand or an arm by the mind, basically, when you think about moving your finger and your finger move. And at the same time, we discovered that people started regaining sensation as well, so it has a receptive component of it, where they can get feeling of touch and they can get feeling of pressure. By the same token, with lower limb, we discovered as well that by accident, as most inventions, is that people that we hook them up with these robotic prostheses, they can feel the ground. And with with amputation, people lose their ability to feel the ground, so they cannot walk into a dark room because they like flying on a hover mat. While with this technology, they can feel everything. They can differentiate between grass, between solid asphalt or marble, and that's a huge advantage that we don't notice with able body. And you realize it when you lose a limb, basically.
Extraordinary. And what kind of impact do those interventions have in people's lives? And what do you see happen in those patients?
Well, I believe in numbers and statistics, and statistically speaking, we converted a lot of the people that we treated from being unemployed to fully employable, and become taxpayers, basically, and return back to work capacity. So that's one aspect, that they moved on with their life, and from feeling disabled to someone who's special with the special functionalities, basically. And what I noticed with a lot of the people that I treated is that they started, if they have lower limb amputation, before the surgery they try to cover their limb, while after the surgery they start wearing shorts to show it off. And that has a massive psychological impact on these people, and obviously on themselves, their self-esteem, their family, and overall the community, basically.
I'd just like to highlight, there's a few people in this room that use prosthetics, and we know them fairly well through AtChat. And I think it's really important that we talk about different assistive technologies for different people and different stages of their life. So for some people that Munjed is working with, that might be a good solution for them. But I know a lot of people in this room that have amputations and wear prosthetics, and they are active, happy, people that have jobs and normal lives. So I think we just have to be mindful of technology being this, the medical side of technology being this catch-all for people's solutions, because it's not. Disability is a normal part of our society. It will always be, and it is okay, you know?
Yep, absolutely. It's an interesting area in so many ways, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that occurs to me is that, we're talking about people's ability to perform functions in life, and we're talking about technology, and both of those things are continuums. We start off in life having very limited functionality. We can't sit up, we can't do anything. We end our life in the same way, and in between we have periods of different levels of functionality, and technology has an impact on our lives, hugely varied impact between people. So there's lots of room between those two things for people to find something that works for their particular circumstances, isn't there? Yeah. Is there anything, you guys gave us that fantastic story of Gary earlier on, operating a 14-acre or hectare farm via remote from an app while being a quadriplegic. Are there any other particular little instances that you'd like to share with us where someone's found a particular technology that works in their particular circumstance?
There's so many stories.
Yeah.
I think, I think that there's some really exciting things that people are starting to do with, there's a product called Orcam, which, sits over glasses, which actually allows people who are vision impaired to start to see. It recognises faces for people, it reads text. I think that's so exciting. I'm really excited to see, and I think this is going to be, in addition to what we were discussing about gaming, there's some real changes, sort of already in motion. The Xbox adaptive controller is one that is going to be a real game changer for people to engage with gaming. So
on a mainstream
level, I think it's going to be $150 that you can buy it in a shop. And again, they've worked with people with disabilities who love gaming into creating this a control which has like larger pads and a joystick, and it has a whole portal along the back. So if you want to customize it, put extra jelly bean switches and that sort of thing. So I think that...
But the interesting thing with that, Joss, I'm not sure if you saw the media that came out about it, but the packaging people, put it in packaging that you couldn't open if you had limited mobility.
Well, you can't get it all, can you?
So I think we've constantly got this situation going on where there might be assistive technologies available or technology available, but as a society we also need to have an awareness, and neither one is going to work without the other. And it's also important to talk about, really basic assistive technologies. So we see people using really low-tech things. I always love looking at Joss's makeup, because I know that she does it herself, and she's got these really cool little splints that she uses to do her makeup. And I just think that sometimes these really simple bits of tech are so effective, and people can adapt them to do the things they want. I think that's
Jane, I think you had a comment you wanted to...
Yeah, and it's in no way taking away from the incredible work that you do, or what you've talked about in terms of disability and ability and accessibility. But often in the space that I work in around anxiety and PTSD and depression and some of the illnesses that don't have a physical capacity to them that you can't physically see. The technologies, again, can really be game changers in that space. And I've got two little examples, if you don't mind.
Please.
I did some work here in Western Australia. I love Western Australia. And I came across for 2 weeks as a guest of the Commissioner for Children and Young People. And it was really to do a really deep dive into understanding what was going on for children and young people here. And as a result of that, and because it is the Commission and they do everything around co-creation and co-design and young people at the core and centre and having voice, I met some incredible young people, but one young girl in particular, she was homeless. She'd been in out-of-home care. She had a whole host of issues, without a doubt, that were challenging because of her life circumstances. So all of those social psycho determinants of it, But she gave an example of for her to come in and get some support, she needed to catch a train. To catch a train, she was so anxious about catching the train to come into the appointment that it was incredibly hard to even get on that train. So she was using a really simple app, and I can't remember the name of the app, but it was around grounding her in getting her breathing under control so that she could physically use her app to keep her focused, to get on the train, to come in and speak to someone about her support networks. So again, it's such a simple example of how these technologies, and it's just an app, can really be game-changing for her as a young woman. Now, there's a whole host of other things that are problematic in that story, but people are doing interesting things to self-manage. I caught up last night with a mate who has severe challenges around mental health, and he said, I'm obsessed with looking at all of these apps that are coming onto the market, and he self-assesses them to determine what works and what doesn't. And I think, again, there's not going to be one app that's going to change the world, or one technology that's going to change the world, or one thing that's going to be the absolute, sort of end of game. It's people choosing things that are going to allow them to function in different ways. So I just wanted to make the point that we often get caught up in a solution, and sometimes there aren't clear solutions. It's often a combination of many things, and I think the empowerment part is so critical.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? With technology moving as fast as it does, how do we even get people to be aware of what's out there? I mean, I wonder how many people listening today or in the broader community would be aware of the things that have been spoken about today. In that great profusion of options, how do we start allowing people to find the thing that works for them? What are some of the challenges on that? Panel? It's a big question.
I mean, there's a plethora of information about assistive technology, and it's really hard to break it down. There's just so much, I mean, even today, learning about areas that I didn't know about. So it is hard to know about everything. And I think, what AtChat tries to do is sort of break it down, create those peer links so that we can educate each other as we go along. So that is definitely a huge challenge. And another consideration is people who live remotely, there's an assumption that people have Wi-Fi. There's an assumption that people have, basic care. I mean, that's not the case. So trying to get that message and trying to break it down for people is definitely one of the challenges.
In the early days of AtChat, Joss and I went all around the state and spoke to people and got an idea of where information was at and what people understood and what people didn't. And under the NDIS, they've got these 3 classifications for assistive technology users. So they've got novice, which is someone that's just starting out, as suggested, developing, and expert. And in the metropolitan area, in the CBD, we meet lots of expert users, and they're generally people that are well connected, they are well linked with suppliers, they know the medical people well, and they have generally seem to have quite good outcomes, and their health is well because of it. The further we moved up the state towards the Kimberley, the more confronting it became for me. And then I realised that, it's a lot more difficult for people to get information when they're more isolated, and how do we overcome that? So, yeah, I think that information can sometimes be overwhelming too. So that's part of our challenge, and we're constantly thinking of ways where we can improve that and think of different ways to communicate with people so they can get that information. Because it's not just peers, it's also linking them with suppliers or with other health experts. And we know that when we've got that whole sort of cross-section approach, then we get better outcomes for people.
So that awareness, but also access.
Yeah.
And Munjed, I must imagine that for your patients, access must be a challenge.
Well, information is out there, but you don't know which one to pick from, and that's a major issue. So you have different levels. So if someone has a form of need, the traditional way of seeking help is, we're talking about medical need here, is to go to the doctor and go to the hospital. And now this is becoming the most regressive, non-progressive aspect, because the technology is out there with miles ahead of what's available to us. But that doesn't mean that we are retarded, as in the health sector, but it means that what is provided throughout the health sector is what's been tested. But sadly, in order to get proper evidence-based medicine, you need years and years of testing and validation of what's available, and then it becomes A, available to the public, and B, funded by the government. And people, for example, patients always come and ask me about stem cell technology, and stem cell technology is not rebatable by the government, because there is no science and there is no proof that it does work. And the government will not fund it, and the test that has been done doesn't support it. While on the other hand, you have people advocating for it in the media and in different forums and providing it. The other aspect is like you have believing in gems and rocks and stones and things like that. With all due respect to that, that's not scientifically proven from the established medical point of view, but it may work. And a lot of patients come to me and they said, what about voodoo medicine? What about this kind of medicine? What do you think of it? Or like going toward Chinese medicine, acupuncture. And my response is always, I'm a medical practitioner. I'm abide by the medical practitioner's law and regulations, and I don't have knowledge that extend to this kind of areas. And if you feel and you believe in it, go for it and do it. But whether you're going to be asking the government to fund it for you or not, that's a different matter. So that's one aspect about availability. Availability is what's regulated, and then you have the other extreme is what's available in the net, and you can have all sorts of things from believing in rocks and to believing into Scientology and all that stuff. And with all due respect to what's his name? Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise, that's right.
But that's where it is. We live in a country that's that's regulated at that level.
Yeah.
And I mean, when I go to China, there are two difference of healthcare over there. There is the traditional Chinese hospitals, and there is the conventional hospitals, and they work completely differently.
So it's the availability of information, but also the roadmap to understand that. Jane?
Yeah, so just to add to that, I think increasingly what we're seeing in our space is this concept of the peer-to-peer network that marries and mashes up with research and development, which I think is truly innovative. I think the bringing together of those things, and you talk about crystals and rocks, that's sort of an extreme example, but there are many practices that people participate in that have no evidence, and yet people will swear that it's actually of value to them.
Yeah.
So, you know, in every other aspect of our life, whether it's a restaurant that we choose or a location that we want to go and visit, or whether it's the Uber that we get into, we rate what we're using. Now, there are so many evidence-based practices that if you actually got people to rate them in terms of practical application, have absolutely no application whatsoever. So I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. I think we need to get the balance between what people actually want and what the evidence allows to be measured. And I think in the States, there's a movement now around patients like me where people are actually voting with their feet and signing up to work in partnership as partners in research rather than as subjects of researchers, to really change the conversation around what are these innovations, what are these interventions, how do we co-design them and build them together, and how do we actually implement things that really do work. And I know for me and my experience with Ndis, there were things that we were doing with him that were of absolutely no value whatsoever. And I knew it intuitively as a mother, I knew it because I've been trained in mental health. And yet the service model was, he must do this. And I was like, it makes no sense. Yeah. But you can't argue against that because that's what the evidence has told us. Well, so just one more thing to finish on. And I think what we're seeing now is an increase in people with a lived experience getting together with professionals who are innovative, who are interested in doing things differently and driving that change. And I see it in mental health and I see it in disability, and it's coming through on our social networks like Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and a whole host of them. And people are connecting with like-minded individuals who actually want to do something differently.
Yeah. Look, I totally agree with you. Actually, if you want to take my personal opinion, I'm all up for this, but I'm just telling you what the system is. But ultimately, as a health practitioner, we are here to serve the community, and we're not here to dictate what the community needs. And that's what we need to change in the way we think. And I think empowering the patient and empowering the receiver of the information and of the service is very important, because ultimately it's for their own best interest, and it's for their own use. And as you said, if a lot of the systems that are set up doesn't make any sense, with reason, then these systems need to change. And the only way to change it, if we have a reciprocal agreement between the recipient and the provider, and any research activity should involve a participation with the recipient rather than being just a subject of a test.
Just on what you were saying about some of the things that aren't recognised, we've done a few stories through AtChat on expert assistive technology users, and two of the things that I found really interesting that aren't recognised is like the equestrian or the use of horses in therapy. And you can really see some of the lovely benefits for some of the children with sensory processing issues, and also for people that have, for me, you know, if you look at my particular situation, I can sit on a horse, and the equestrian therapy can really help with that gait improvement, stabilising the core muscles. So there is, it's well understood, it is helpful, but it's not recognised. So there's that example, and also a lovely family that we did a story on, and the family all has a certain level, of all on the autism spectrum, and they've got this lovely dog, and they call her their dogonology, like their assistive dogonology, because they didn't even expect it. They just got this puppy, and one of the children, it would really help to settle the children, and they say that that's one of the best assistive dogonologies that they stumbled across.
Fantastic. I'm cognizant that we're getting close to time. Could I ask everyone to give just a really brief vision, what your vision for assistive technology or surgical procedures might be for the future for helping people with disabilities, as brief as you can.
Sure.
I just would love it to be accessible and well-funded. That's the two sort of things that I'd like to see with assistive technology.
Don't lie, Joss. You want driverless cars.
I do. I won't lie. I won't lie. I've been hedging my bets, but now that I've talked to Dr. Munjed, maybe I want robotics. I would love the opportunity to be able to independently take my child to school. Currently, someone always drives me, and just the idea of having technology as it develops to be able to do those sorts of things like driverless technology. And hey, maybe I might be able to walk her to school with robotics. So, the world is our oyster as long as it's accessible and well funded.
And for me, I look forward to technology having better interface with our society, and that creating a more equitable society for people with disability in the workplace or with recreation within sporting groups, that assistive technology can be universal in its design, non-stigmatised, and help us to, like I said, globally be more equitable as a society.
Ooh.
Too big a question.
Well, look, I think I'll turn that around. I think the society need to accept people as they are. And we should start accepting each other because we're all different. And disability is disability in the mind. It's not in the physical status. But the way things are going, we are relying more and more on technologies, whether they are the iPhones or whether they are wheelchairs. Ultimately, we will have much more powerful machines, much smaller in size, and we will use our body less and less. And I mentioned it before, we'll have much bigger heads, bigger eyes, bigger ears, but much smaller arms and bigger fingers.
That's your evolution theory.
I hope that doesn't happen. I suppose if I wave the magic wand, my wish would be that we had a more open interest in innovation that positioned people at the core of that and at the design of that.
I agree with that.
Whether that's in research, and often our research sits in our universities, or whether that's in practice, so how do we actually embed it in a practice, and whether that's in our policymakers being far more acceptive of innovation as something that's going to drive change. I don't think that's about the technologies, I think that's actually about the processes and the policies in place.
Yeah.
That is very important because unfortunately, I see it on the receiving end. A majority of our policymakers are dinosaurs, and that is a major problem. We need to have more innovators in our society, and people that have open mind rather than living in the past, basically.
So one quick question for Munjed and Jane. So how do you think, if we're in a world where we've got policymakers as dinosaurs and we need innovation, how do you think that we crack that open and get that happening?
What you think I've seen some incredible ways in which policymakers have actually come to the table and really changed their practice, particularly in Veterans Affairs and increasingly in health, where they actually come to co-design and co-creation workshops and sit as active partners rather than observers. So the biggest thing for me is we talk about co-creation and co-design, and it's as though the people over here are designing and then the policymaker has to implement it. To me, the greatest success stories are when you have the policymaker sitting with people, sitting with practitioners, sitting with researchers and really shaping whatever the intervention might be, because that's when you understand what it means to live the experience.
Yeah.
Well, look, the problem is, this is one of the downside, and we had a chat about that, about the society and democracy. The world went through a revolution in the 20th century and the 19th century with the invention of electricity, invention of the steam engines, invention of a lot of things. Associated with that, there was a lot of inventions that caused a lot of harm. In the early 1900s, children were given radium tablets to cure flu. And as a result of that, a lot of children ended up with cancers. So, so there is a balance between that extreme, and then as a knee-jerk of that, the FDA in America developed, and that became the biggest governing body to regulate innovators and to become a barrier and filter from between the companies manufacturing products and the receiving end, which is the public. And then this grew up to become a major giant that is prohibitive to any kind of innovation. And as Australians, we always follow the Americans. We have our regulatory bodies as well. Luckily, we're not as bad as the Americans, but we are following in that path. While you have the other end and the other extreme where you have dictatorships and people come in small islands and they're run by crazy people and they come up with an idea and they make it happen. So there should be a balance between the two.
It's an intersection of a lot of different areas, a lot of different challenges for us as a community, this area of assistive technology. We've got time for some questions now. If we can open the floor, listening to these quite challenging ideas, has there been any burning questions for anybody? We've got a roving mic, I believe.
Yep.
It's never easy to be
brave.
first. Over here, yep.
Yep.
Yes, Sam. Love it.
Thank you, Sam. A lot of the things you've talked about, are things which, as a person with a disability, thinking about all the time, those things about, the dilemmas of whether you get stuff done to your body or not, and the challenge that faces, the dilemmas of who gets access to things or not. And I was wondering a little bit more about who gets access or not to technology. So there was discussion about my health record, discussion about, even innovative things that are happening now in terms of prosthetics and things like that. And just very aware that in the area that I work in, 40% of the people that we would talk to around NDIS, for example, actually don't even have access to email. They actually, there's a digital divide there, and so wondering about how we might address some of those things where on the one hand we've got fantastic things happening, but on the other there's actually people that there's no way that they're ever going to be able to access any of that stuff you're talking about.
Thoughts, panel?
I'm happy to kick off. I think disparities in access to healthcare are age-old, and the technologies potentially could solve it, but I think your point is incredibly well made, that those who are most vulnerable are probably the least likely to be using the technologies that could be the most assistive. I think there are major challenges with NDIS around who's eligible and who's not. So in my space around psychosocial disability, people who live with a mental illness, they're facing severe challenges of getting onto the system, let alone accessing the tools and the resources. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anyone does. And as with any major reform, in NDIS, without a doubt, is the equivalent of Medicare in my mind. It's got major challenges, but also huge opportunities. I think it's going to be a toing and froing and constant storytelling and making sure that we've got people's voices being heard, so that we can start to address those challenges.
I think it's a bit unfair that we make a comment about this kind of aspect, because it's the government that we need a government body here to answer that.
Health Minister.
Because that's a question to our government, basically. But Living in Australia, we have certain standard of care that's available to everybody, and that's the public health sector. And the bar changes from time to time, what's available, what's not available. We used to have, until recently, like state-based disability schemes, and they vary to a certain extent from one state to the other. And we have our challenges with dealing with the disability schemes in different areas. And now this is being changed to the Ndis, where the national body scheme is taking over. And it's still in the process of setting up where is the funding and what do they fund and what level. And ultimately speaking, it's all about how much voice do you have and how much you push with your politicians, and how much the government should put money into that area, and if they are interested or not.
Do you guys want to respond to that, or should we call for a...
No, good, I think.
Yep. Any other questions? We've got one at the front here. In the middle, third row, yep.
What about people who get sort of lost in the cracks? I have a vision impairment, which means that I can't drive. It also means that I can't read standard print books, can't read the newspaper, need to enlarge font on iPads, on any kind of device, but I am not covered by the NDIS. So basically I'm stuck in a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
So what happens there?
Well, we're in the same category for different reasons, and yeah, I won't speak for Joss, but you and I are in the same position, and I remember someone when I left hospital a long time ago that said, Danielle, there's one thing that you're going to have to accept, is that you're going to be called, you are going to be the walking wounded for the rest of your life, and you need to understand that. So I did get my head around that, and I had an awareness that society, because I'm not disabled enough, I would be on my own. And I am lucky enough that I have had the opportunities at education, and I'm well connected. So in my network, I can find people that can help answer the questions I might have in regard to mobility challenges or achieving the goals that I want to. I have support around me. But yes, to answer your question, there isn't really one for it. You kind of have to do it yourself, and there are some funding opportunities out there for certain specific things, but you have to get well connected in with those areas. So for me, it's the spinal cord unit at Fiona Stanley, for example, will help me with the podiatry, with the physiotherapy and things that I need. So I need to be in that system to get some of the support that I need, and that will help me in my life. But no, I don't fit into a scheme as yourself.
Well, again, your situation is similar to a lot of people, because with visual impairment, if it can be rectified by surgical procedure, then it should be covered by Medicare, okay? But we are far from that at this stage, to a certain limit. It depends on the case by case. But if there is a chance to implant an eye in your orbit, then that should be a Medicare funding. But then if you want to hook up an eye just beside your face, okay, and use it as a prosthesis that will give you assistive vision, okay, which is available to a certain extent, then that falls outside the Medicare, because that's an external component, similar to a wheelchair, basically. So that falls under NDIS, possibly. So again, we don't know where, and I face that all the time with my patients, because there are certain component that's covered by Medicare, and there are other components partially covered by NDIS, and there is something, the link between the two is not covered by anybody. Okay, so the patient have to cop it from their own pocket as well. So,
ladies and gentlemen, we're at the end of our time. Can I invite you to thank our fantastic panel?
Thank you.